Now that we learn how to retrieve weather information for each particular city, we now want to set up our Firebase Firestore collection to store a reference of cities, and then we'll go ahead and call this get method here for that particular city, and then store the information here in an array inside of our data. Okay, so what we need to do first before we get started with any of that is actually head over to Firebase and set up our project. Now to create a new project here on Firebase, we're going to select the option of go to console, and then here we have an option to add a new project. As you can see, here is the one we're currently using for the demo. So what we're going to do is we're going to select add project here, and we're going to call this Weather App YouTube. Okay, and you can name this whatever you like. I'm just naming it accordingly for this video and series. So we're going to go ahead and click continue here. Now we have access to use Google Analytics for your Firebase project. We're going to go ahead and disable it for this series. And then there you go. It's going to create our project, and once it is complete, it will be taken to the dashboard. So once this is done, I will be back. Okay, so that is all complete, and now our project is ready to use. So I'm going to go ahead and click continue here, and it's going to take us to our Firebase console here. So what we need to do is integrate Firebase into our project. So let's go ahead and do just that. So we can start by clicking the web here, which is going to give us the option to register our Firebase web app. So we're going to once again call this Weather App YouTube. And we will be deploying this to Firebase hosting at the end, but we're not going to do that right now. So I'm just going to go ahead and leave that unchecked. And we're going to go ahead and register the app here, and it's going to return us this Firebase SDK. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy this right here, and we're going to head over to our project. And what we need to do now is we're going to create a new folder here in our SRC, and we're going to give this a name of Firebase, and then we're going to go ahead below, or inside of this folder I should say, we're going to go ahead and give this a name of we're going to say Firebase init.js. Okay, and then what we need to do is we need to go at the very top here, and we're going to say import Firebase from, and we're going to say Firebase/app, and then we also need to import, let's see, import, we're going to say Firebase/fire and Firebase, sorry, not Firebase dash Firestore, just Firebase/Firestore. Okay, and now below this, we're going to simply import that config that we have from our SDK here on the Firebase website. And then below this, we can see we have to initialize our app. So what I'm going to do is we're going to say const Firebase app equals the Firebase.initialize app Firebase config, and then we need to export this file. So we're going to say export defaults, I can type, and then we're going to say Firebase app, which is this right here, and we're going to say .firestore. Okay, and now with that being said, we now have Firebase integrated into our project. So let's head back over to Firebase and actually begin setting up our Firestore collection for all of the cities we're going to be using for this app. Okay, back here on our Firebase console, we're going to select the Cloud Firestore here. And right now we don't have one set up, so we need to go ahead and create our database here. And we're going to start in test mode. And we're going to select next, and we're going to keep this default for the CloudStore Fire location, and we're going to go ahead and hit enable. Now we also have to wait for this to provision, which will take a few minutes. So once it is all set, I will be back. Okay, so as you can see, our database is now complete and ready to go. We just need to go ahead and add some data. So to begin here, to give ourselves some references to go ahead and obtain when we set up our method to retrieve these cities, let's actually add some here. So let's go ahead and start with a new collection. We're going to call this cities, and we're going to hit next. Now we need to go ahead and give this city collection some data, or an actual document I should say. So let's go ahead for the document ID. We're going to auto ID this, and for the field we're going to say city, which is going to equal the default value here of a string, and let's go ahead and give this one a value of Detroit. Okay, so we're going to save that, and as you can see here, we now have the collection of cities with a document of cities. So let's go ahead and add one more document here in the cities collection. So we're going to go ahead and auto ID this, Going to give it a value or a field of city, and then let's say Dallas. And let's go ahead and save that. So right now, inside of the cities collection, we now have 2 entries. So let's head back over to our Vue project and begin to set up the function and methods to go ahead and retrieve this data and then take the value of each city and run an API call to our OpenWeather API to get the current weather. Now, before we can actually use our Firestore collection here in our Vue project, we first need to import our Firebase init file that we went ahead and created earlier into the component that we want to use the Firestore collection in. So that's going to be in our app.vue. So I'm going to import that right below our Axios. We're going to say import db, and we're going to say from, and then look for our Firebase folder, and then we want to look for Firebase init. Okay, and I'm going to put a semicolon there. Now, next up inside of our data here, I want to create a new value, and we're going to call this cities, and we're going to set this equal to an empty array. Now, what this empty array is going to be for is each time we run through our Firestore collection, we're going to get a new value for our city, and then we're also going to have values for our current weather. So each one of those are going to be in an object, so we're going to push each one of those to our cities array each time we have a new city that we're seeing from our Firestore collection. Okay. Now, we no longer need to call this in our created lifecycle hook because we're not going to be calling this function any longer. Then we can actually go inside of our methods and begin to create our new Firestore collection function. So let's call this get city weather. Open this up and put a semicolon or a comma there. Now, the first thing I want to do is get a reference to our Firestore collection and put that into a variable because we're going to be using the collection reference a few times here in this function, and it makes sense to simplify that by storing it in a variable. So we're going to say let Firebase DB equal to db.collection, and we're going to call this cities because that's the name we went ahead and gave it on our Firestore console. Okay, next up, we actually want to obtain the actual document. So how we're going to do that is we're going to reference Firebase DB, and we're going to call a method called onSnapshot. So onSnapshot is actually the Firebase real-time listener. So each time the snapshot is updated or changed, this will go ahead and run. Okay, so we're going to pass this a parameter of snap and then an arrow function here. So then we're going to say snap, and then we're going to pass the method docChanges. And then we're going to pass the for each loop here. And inside of the for each loop, we're going to run some code for each one of our documents that Firestore returns. Okay, so we're going to pass this a parameter of doc and then open this up. And before I forget, we're going to be running this asynchronously here. So I'm going to wrap this in a parenthesis, and then outside of that, we're going to say async. So if I was to console log what we're returning right now, if I say console.log and say doc, now before we actually get any results here, we actually need to call that in our created lifecycle hook. So we're going to say this dot get city weather and then save that. So right now what you're going to see here is 2 values that are returned. Now the reason we're seeing 2 is because in our Firestore collection we have 2 items here. Now, you're not going to really get much information out of just console.logging the doc here. One thing we're going to be looking at is the type of addit. So for reference, Firestore returns 3 different types. You have addit, modified, and remove. So for this part of the series and this function, we're only going to be worrying about the type of addit. Later on in the series, once we get to adding and removing cities, we'll get back to those type of types. So anyways, you can see here that all this other information really has no meaning. So you can see that we also have another doc object in here, but once again, nothing really is pertaining to what we are looking for. So we actually have this ID value here, which we'll be using as well. But how do we actually see the data or cities that we have in our collection here? So what we can do is we can say doc.doc, and then we can pass the data method here. The data method will return all the data for that particular collection item. So as you can see right now, we only have the city field. So if we just wanted to return the city field, say if we had more information inside of this collection item, we can just return the city value by saying .city. or whatever the field that you named it was. Okay, so we no longer need this console.log method here. So now what we want to do is we want to run a if check here. So like I mentioned earlier, we're only going to be worrying about the type of added. So we're going to check right now if the doc.type that is being passed is equal to added. Okay, and if it is added, then we're going to run this code here inside of this statement. So what is that code we're going to run? We're actually going to start with a try catch block here. So we're going to say try this, and if you get an error, catch it and let us know what that error is. And then we can just simply come down here, say console.log the error. All right, so inside of our try block here, what do we want to do? So we want to start by going out and getting the current information or current weather for the city that is currently being iterated here in our for each loop. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here and I'm going to copy this Axios method. So since we're going to be using asynchronous function or asynchronous here, I can say const response and set this equal to await, if I can spell, await, and we want to await the response from our Axios call here. So if I save this, we're going to get an error. That's okay. So right now what's going on here is we're going to try first to reach out to this URL here and return, we're going to reach out to this URL and wait for it to return its results, okay? So right now we are passing it this.city, which we don't want. If you recall earlier, I showed you how we can actually get that particular city name by saying doc.doc.data, and then we can say .city. Okay, so that'll give us a reference to the current city that is being iterated here in our for each loop, and then it will go out and look for that information or that weather for that city. Okay, so once that is done, we want to do something with the response. We want to store that response in, or we want to store that data in another constant here. So we're going to say const data is equal to response.data. And then let's just console log this data for now and see what we're getting. So if we do that, you'll see that now we are getting the weather information for each one of our cities. So that is great. Now that we have the data, what do you want to do with it? So we need to actually reach out to our Firestore collection and say, hey, we have this data, let's update it and add it to our collection item here. So how do we do that? Now, how we can do that is simply by saying Firebase DB, and we want to get a reference to the document that we want to update. So if you recall, we are able to get a reference to our document ID by saying doc.doc, which is right here, and inside there we have this unique ID, which as you can see, this one right here pertains to the city of Dallas. So each one of our collection items has a unique ID. So what we're going to be saying here is we're going to look for the we're going to reach back out to our collection of cities and look for the document that matches this ID. So how we can say that is doc.doc.id. So what this is going to do is going to say, hey, we have this collection right here, which is equal to Dallas. So let's go ahead and update that information for the current weather and set it equal to the response we have here from our OpenWeatherMap API. Okay, so we can say update here. And then we're going to pass it the current. We're going to call, so we're creating this. So we're going to call this field current weather. We can name this anything we want, but it makes sense to call it current weather. And then we're going to set that equal to our data. Okay. So now if I was to head over to Firestore, you should see now that we have the current weather for the city of Dallas with Dallas. And if I come over to Detroit, you should see that now we have the current weather for the city of Detroit. So that is all working great, but we're not done just yet. So like I said earlier, we have this cities array right here that I want to pass this information to here. So how we can do that now is by saying once this is updated, tag on a .then method here. And then inside here, we want to run a callback function. And then we want to say this .cities.push. Then we want to push that entire collection to our cities array. So we're going to say doc.doc.cities. data. And then we can see this if I then go ahead and say, once this is complete, then let's console.log that data. So let's go ahead and pass this another callback function here. And I'll get rid of this because we're not going to be keeping this. I just want to show you this, that it's actually there and how this is working. So we're going to say console.log this dot cities. Okay. So if I remove all this to clear out our console here, and if I refresh it, you should see now we're going to get this response right here with both of our arrays. So as you can see here, we have 2 arrays for 2 of our cities. So in here we have the city of Dallas, and we have the current weather, which is an object, and all of the current weather information here. So now what we have going on in our function here is we're getting a reference to all of our cities and the current weather, and we're storing it here in this cities array. So that is going to do it for this video. Now in the next one, we're actually going to take this data and start to actually build out our application. So we'll get to that in the next video.